John, it's an honor to have you here. Last time you and I talked, you were on my radio show, and we talked about Moonshot, which was that book during that time, which, by the way, I think when you look at AstroTeller from Google, and they have their own Moonshot laboratory, we need to, no matter what, still think in a moonshot type of space. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic thesis really came from Google. Moonshot means 10x, that you have to look beyond. And that is so typical to the way Steve Jobs thought when we worked together. Steve used to call it zooming out. He'd say, you know, we've got to zoom out beyond the conventional boundaries of how people think about our industry and think about what it could be, not what people expect it to be. And in fact, that was the reason why I got recruited to Apple in the first place, because back in the early 1980s, the only person in Silicon Valley who thought personal computers would be used for something other than making cheaper, faster mini computers was Steve Jobs. And he said, no, the real future of computers are going to be for the rest of us, the people who are non-technical, who will be able to do these amazing creative things. And he called it bicycles for the mind. And he was reaching out, breaking the boundaries. So yeah, absolutely, it takes that kind of thinking.
Well, I admire where you're at in the world, because generally people over 60 have a tendency to accept the way things are. You have not accepted anything the way things are. You are looking at exponential growth, not just in technology, but in medicine and in science and all those areas. You're very active in the exponential community, right?
Absolutely. So I don't have any interest to retire. I don't actually run companies anymore, but I work with a small number of really talented entrepreneurs who want to do either noble causes or break out in the world of science. Because back when I joined Silicon Valley, the only exponential technology, meaning something that was growing at the compounding power of math, was Moore's law. And now we have all kinds of exponential opportunities that are going on in biology and chemistry and so many different fields, data science, that I'm actively involved today. I have been for almost 15 years into healthcare and into biotech. So I'm currently working with a company called Cellularity, where we are taking cell therapies for, started with cancer, where we were able to take the placenta, which is the most perfect source material for building anything in the biotech world, because it's allogeneic. It has no side effects. It won't be rejected by anybody. And we've been building cell therapies for people with glioblastoma, acute myeloid leukemia, and multiple myeloma. But we do it by taking these really, call it a platform, because platforms is well understood in the tech world, but it's relatively a new way to think about it in the bio techno world. So we build a platform with these allogeneic stem cells, and we're now able to scale. We just finished a $75 million factory to do this. We're able to scale precision medicine from today. It's only treated about 3,000 people. We're able to scale it to be able to treat tens of thousands, even eventually hundreds of thousands. And just recently, we took a derivative of that, because it turns out that the stem cells that we use, which are natural stem cells coming from the placenta, that they also contain what are called NK cells, natural killer cells, which are able to take antigens and turn them into antibodies. And we're now in trials with a corona treatment in about almost 100 hospitals, hospital patients in about 7 different hospitals. So I do that. I also am in the next generation of telecommunications, working on 5G with one of my very old and great friends, Steve Perlman, who invented Apple QuickTime and invented several other technologies along the way. Steve came up with an entirely orthogonal way to think about the way of communicating in 5G. And he's now built out the technology where you can take a standard LTE smartphone and be able to do 5G in what's called CBRS, the Citizens Band Radio Services, at the 3.5 gig bandwidth. So we're doing some really
John,
cool
I'm
stuff
just
there.
curious.
And a
You
number of
mentioned,
other companies, different
you
fields.
mentioned a couple of things, and I'm just wondering, when you start to hear conspiracy theories in different spaces, you mentioned two things, Corona, and you mentioned possible testing or cure. We hear conspiracy theories around that. When you say 5G, we hear conspiracy theories around that. Isn't it difficult to be in a place to where it's just not smooth sailing? Like if I say, we're going to do Moore's Law and we're going to break it, everyone says, oh, acceptable, we've done it. No one says, oh, you can't do that. If you do it, it's going to break down the fabric of time and it's the end of the world. There's no craziness when it comes to the progression of technology. But when you go into a new technology, people have a tendency to go somewhat crazy. How do you fight against that?
Well, the kind of people I hang out with, we're what's called the misfits. We're the ones who are always saying, well, why not try something a different way? So I remember one of my favorite MIT professors was Professor Marvin Minsky. Marvin used to say, you don't really understand something well unless you understand it more than one way. And I've seen that through my entire work life, that you have to constantly question. When Steve Perlman first came up with his different approach to 5G, most of the people who were experts in telecommunications, chief technology officers of the big wireless carriers, said, well, this is crazy, it won't work. It violates Shannon's information theory. And then we had to remind them that when Claude Shannon was developing his information theory, there was no digital wireless communications. And in fact, it doesn't violate Shannon's information theory. It just means you've got to think about it, interpret it another way. So we found that when you go to 5G and you've got much faster, more data moving in from a smaller distance from cell to cell, that the biggest problem was congestion, and that you'd quickly be overwhelmed by the noise and the congestion. Well, it turns out with Steve Perlman's approach, it's the congestion, which is the enabler, that makes it work so effectively, because we call it a P-cell. The cell actually follows around you, and there is no dispersed signal as you would have in a traditional wireless situation. But I'm also working on other cool stuff with people who are also really smart people looking at things in a different way. We have a company that I work with over in London that came up with a way to do non-invasive blood glucose monitoring, which means be able to look at the blood capillaries and being able to monitor exactly what your blood glucose is. Turns out that same technology has enabled us to go into using our really harmless electrical field and looking deep into a lady's breast. We can do early detection of breast cancer well before you could discover it with a mammogram. And if you get it early enough, no one would die. So on the one hand, I'm working over in the cell therapy world where we're trying to cure people with different forms of cancer. In the other places, we're saying, hey, we can actually save more lives going in and doing early detection.
John, where do you have free time?
I beg your pardon?
Where do you have free time?
Well, I'm up every morning at 5 in the morning, and I'm usually on the phone till late in the evening. And this is what I do for fun. And fortunately, my wife and I do it together. Diane is a computer scientist and a mathematician, and so she has as much fun with this as I do.
Well, Diane's pretty amazing. You're very fortunate to have somebody that you just don't love, but you respect too, which is incredible. There's two people on this call that Steve Jobs theoretically worked with or for.
Uh-huh.
You're one of them, and the other one is Nolan Bushnell. Nolan is part of our
Oh,
group.
no, Nolan was, yeah, he gave Steve a start. Absolutely.
Yep, Nolan is here.
Nolan is a legend in Silicon Valley. I mean, he was, I remember when I showed up in Silicon Valley, you'd say, well, who is doing the really great stuff? And I was asking Steve, and he said, Nolan Bushnell. I used to work for Nolan. Both he and Woz did.
Okay, so here's the quiz question. What video game did Steve and Woz create for Atari?
Don't if I know.
Nolan, can you tell us real quick? Nolan, are you there? Let's pop up Nolan and see if Nolan can answer that question.
I'm not seeing Nolan anywhere in the chat.
Oh, he's not here right now? Okay,
I don't see him.
It was Breakout.
Yeah, I remember the name. Yeah,
it was Breakout.
Never played it.
So you're going through all these different technologies that you see where there's next level advancement. Is there anything that you wish you could go into the past and fix to make it so it was better? Like it could have had an opportunity, it could have been great, but it didn't have enough emphasis?
Well, the thing which I found was when we were working on things which had never been done before, the biggest mistakes we usually made was we overestimated when it was ready to come out of the oven and be ready for real people to use it. So I remember back in the early 1980s, Steve and I were talking about, wouldn't it be neat to put a Macintosh in a phone? Well, you couldn't do anything like that back in the 1980s. We didn't even have cell phones in those days. But I remember in the late 80s and early 90s when we were working on the first handheld computing devices, and we had two different companies that we started. One was inside of Apple, which was called Newton, and that's where we actually co-developed the first low-powered microprocessor that's in every smartphone today. There are about 8 billion of them out there now, which is called the ARM processor. And the Newton was never successful commercially, though we did, Apple later sold it for $800 million. But it was, we thought that phones, digital phones that would be able to do amazing things like the iPhone would be available sometime in the early to mid 1990s, and we were off by over a decade. There was another company that was started by three of my friends who at Apple who came up with a company called General Magic.
Sure.
Mark Bratt, Andy Hertzfeld, and Bill Atkinson. And I was on their board, and I helped open doors for them and bringing in resources. This probably had the most talented group of individuals of any company. That some of you may have seen the video they showed on airplanes now. The most famous company that no one's ever heard of. General Magic invented so many of the things that we take for granted inside smartphones today, but they were 15 years too early. And no one had miniaturized the hardware and made it powerful enough to do the kinds of things that you'd eventually want to be able to do.
And
So,
we're not sitting here reminiscing and saying, oh, I wish, but there are certain technologies, even from the 90s, that I wish were here today because I think they were better back then. Do you remember Wildfire or Portico? Do you remember those platforms? They were kind of like what, or Weebly was another one. They were like what Google Voice is, but it was voice automated. You could talk to your phone inside your phone and it would do all these cool things. And you didn't have to touch a keypad.
yeah.
All those, nothing happened to those technologies. They just disappeared.
Yeah, there was a post-grad student that I recruited from Carnegie Mellon named Kai-Fu Lee. Some of you may have heard of Kai-Fu. He ended up being the CEO of Microsoft China, and then he was also CEO of Google China years later. But Kai-Fu was a brilliant scientist who came up with the first voice digital assistant, which was called Casper. And he and I demonstrated it with Joan London on ABC Good Morning America.
Good Morning America.
Yeah. And, you know, we did it with the idea that this would be built into a Macintosh. Well, look how many years it took for voice digital assistants to get to the point where we have Alexa today.
Or Siri. Siri, come on.
Or
Gotta be
Siri, yeah.
fair.
Yeah.
But let's look at Tim Cook now. Tim Cook has actually outsold Steve Jobs and you when you're at Apple.
Absolutely.
Tim Cook really is the quiet CEO that really has taken that company to a whole different level, right?
It's amazing what he's done. It's really terrific. Yeah, he has a skill which is not my skill. That he knows how to scale a business with no compromises in terms of the quality of the product which they deliver, and that's an amazing skill. As I suspect a number of people on this call know, Apple purposely lags Samsung by about 18 months to 2 years in technology. And anyone who is involved with technology knows that the first edition of any product always has some challenges in it, particularly when you're trying to do it at the scale of an Apple or any other large company like that. And so you can improve the yield of a new technology in the second or third year much better than you can in the first year. And so Apple purposely scales their business by focusing on incredible design. I think of Apple more like LVMH than a technology company, because it focuses on the beauty of its products and design. It focuses on fit and finish, every detail of the product, no compromises on the user experience. So the reason Steve and I hit it off was that I had studied industrial design. I had gone to Brown University and RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and the Graduate School of Architecture at Penn. And so it was design that brought us together. As most people know today, Steve was not an engineer, but he had an amazing insight on design. And those foundational principles that Apple has even today were all formed by Steve Jobs back in those early days when I had a chance to work with him.
What do you use? Are you using a Mac or are you using a PC?
No, I use a Mac.
Yes.
We have every Apple product.
John, I really appreciate you sharing time with us. And I know that you have an incredible partner, so you're actually having a good time during this quarantine. I know you are.
Yeah, it's been pretty easy for me. We live here in Palm Beach, Florida, so we're right on the ocean, so I can still go out on the beach. And the best part of it is I don't have to fly around and travel on planes and stay in hotels. I do everything over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever people want to use. So it's an incredibly productive time. And I think that when this coronavirus pandemic is over, that people are going to really rethink how they want to work. And I suspect it's going to mean for business, a lot less business traveling. Has real implications, therefore, for a lot of other industries.
Well, it was an honor to have you on today. I really appreciate making time for all of us.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Ken.
Thanks, John. John Sculley, an amazing guy. His last book was called Moonshot. It's something you should check out because it's a good way of thinking. It's an important way of thinking, the whole exponential concept. He also worked with Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil and some of these outside the box thinkers. And I love when I see somebody that, I'm a few years younger than him, but he's inspirational because I know that if I follow what he's doing, I'm going to look as good as him.